Good morning once again. Let's ask God's blessing on the service, on the message. Father, we thank you for the privilege to gather together in freedom and peace and the health that you've given us. And in spite of all the ups and downs and health traumas that we have, we know that you are always with us. You never delay. Everything is done in your time frame, and you have compassion for us in every aspect of our lives, everything that we go through. So, Father, I ask your blessing on this message. One of the most important passages, I believe, in the life of Jesus Christ that we have recorded for us, showing his power, his strength, the very fact that he's your son, and everything he did is to your glory. So I ask, Father, that everything is said and done here, be done to your glory, and ask it all in Jesus' name. Amen. I know what's on everybody's mind after hearing the reading of the passage, 1 through 45, or 1 through 40, or various adjustments thereof. Actually, you only heard 18 verses out of 45. I started with the 45, said, no, that's way too much. No, I'm not going to ask somebody to read that much. It would take 2 full pages. I reduced it down to 36 or so. That was a little better, but it was still almost 2 full pages. I said, no, that's still too much. So I finally whittled away and got down to what really I needed to cover anyway, as far as the message and as far as the overall coverage of the scripture, the passage itself, down to about 18 verses. So it was fit nicely on one page and cut down the time we have to listen to the reading. A lot of things, even some of those that weren't mentioned in the passage, I will be sharing with you also during the message. Now, one of the reasons I reduced it down to just 18 verses was partly because the length of time it would take to read it, for one thing. Plus, there's just way too much material covered in those 45 verses, really, come to think of it. A lot of material that we need to take just maybe a couple of points and really zero in on and drill into and expand on that, because everything in there is so important. Now, the 2 that I've chosen may not be the most important overall, but they're vital. And if you've seen the title of the message, you've got the 2 points right there. Jesus waited and Jesus wept. That's all you need to know. So we can go home, go to lunch. No, there's a lot of expansion just on those 2 points alone that are so important in the way Jesus lived, the way he healed, the way he walked this earth, giving an example for us as well, things that we can also learn from and to know him and know better how he functioned and how he was so merciful and kind and all of his power that he displayed. So let's get right into it. The first point, if you want to call it a point, first high point I would call it, is Jesus waited. And that was mentioned. Jesus waited 2 more days after he was told about the fact that his friend that he loved Martha and Mary and their brother Lazarus. And that's why the sister sent this message to him, because I know he would come. They didn't even ask him to come. They said, our brother whom you love is very sick. That was day 1. So let's look at a couple points here. Why did Jesus wait? There's more than one reason why. We look at it. Let's review that again, verses 6 through 7. It says, so when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. And then he said to his disciples, let us go back to Judea. Then we'll skip ahead into verses 11 through 15. I'm leaving out some of the conversation, which is important, but those could be other points covered in a different message, perhaps. Verses 11 through 15, he says, he went on to tell them, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, and I'm going there to wake him up. His disciples replied, Lord, if he sleeps, he will get better. Jesus had been speaking of his death, but his disciples thought he meant natural sleep. So then he told them plainly, Lazarus is dead, and for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him." So why did he wait 2 more days? Well, he partly answered that question right there. He says, "For your sakes I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe." That extra time was necessary to strengthen their belief. If he just rushed back right away and healed him instantaneously and he didn't die, that's a level of belief and trust. But what if he died? Not just died dead for 1 or 2 days, but for 4 days. In verses 41 through 42 of the same chapter, Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." Again, he's strengthening the reason for him arriving 4 days late. God is glorified, and Jesus is glorified as God's Son by what he did here. Another point to substantiate why he waited 2 more days. Raising the dead was more impressive than healing from sickness. Obviously, it hadn't been done. Not many people witnessed it before. Jesus performed 3 of them, at least that are recorded. He may have done quite a few more than that, as well as other miracles. So the 4 days, how did we get 4 days out of that? Well, where Jesus was about 1 full day from where Bethany was, where Lazarus was sick. So it took a day for the messenger to get to Jesus. That's 1 day. He waited 2 more days, and then he left on the 4th day and got back another day's time. So that's 4 days. So by waiting 4 days, there was no doubt that Lazarus was dead. In fact, the Jewish custom has been, maybe still is today to a degree, when a person dies, they're buried as quickly as possible, sometimes the same day, especially back then. And they had the ability to do that. So he was in this cave, a stone rolled over it. He was buried right away to support the belief that, or the practice that the dead were buried immediately. And an interesting thing about the 4-day thing too, which may factor in, it's not mentioned in the Bible. There's nothing biblical as far as the practice, but many Jews had the belief that when a person died, the soul lingered around the body for 3 more days, thinking that, okay, we'll give this body a chance to come back. If it is, then the soul will reunite with the body, and we're back alive again, resuscitated, as it were. So maybe waiting 4 days made sure, the body gave up, the spirit gave up, and that was it. He was really dead. That's just an interesting point there, side note. The third, and I think another very important point, sometimes we overlook, but we see this mentioned over and over in practice in the life of Jesus as he walked this earth. And that point is that Jesus had his own time schedule. He didn't operate by anybody else's schedules, traditions, expectations. He did what he knew was the right thing to do at the right time. And there's a reason for it. Very interesting. Mark Buchanan, he's written a number of books that I've gotten into recently, and a pastor, wrote a very almost astounding statement that took some further investigation on my part, and just think about it. Just give it some consideration, because we're going to give some time going into this, what he said. Mark Buchanan said, "One of the most convicting things I have recently come to realize about Jesus is that he was never, not once, in a hurry." That's a pretty profound statement, I think, in one sense. Of course, we have to get into defining what is a hurry. It's just not just rushing one point to another. It goes deeper than that. And one time, the same author, Mark Buchanan, someone asked him, "What is your biggest regret in life?" And he thought about it for a minute, and he says, "Being in a hurry." And here he defines that. He says, "Getting to the next thing without fully entering the thing in front of me. I cannot think of a single advantage I've ever gained from being in a hurry. but 1,000 broken and missed things, tens of thousands lie in the wake of all that rushing. Through all that haste, I thought I was making up time. It turns out I was throwing it away. Very profound statements. I think maybe, I know I could admit that there are times when I just rushed, not only physically, but mentally, spiritually perhaps too. Not staying where I was, completing the task, and being totally absorbed, but thinking about what's ahead and worrying about it, fearful about it. And so I had this feeling of rushing, hurrying, always from one thing to the next. John Ortberg, another well-known author, written a number of books, pastored a number of churches, spoken, and is pretty well known. Probably a lot better known than Mark Buchanan, but they know each other. John Ortberg, a number of years ago, I don't know, in his ministry, it might have been 10, 15, 20 years ago or more, he was taking on a new responsibility in a large church in Chicago. He had already had a lot of experience as a pastor, administrator in church, written books, and was very competent to take over this responsibility. But he still needed some encouragement, something, maybe some little tidbits of wisdom that would help him. So he referred back to his mentor, Dallas Willard. Pretty well known. He's written a lot of books. He's spoken a lot. He's been a mentor to a lot of Christian pastors. He taught for decades as a professor at USC. He passed away a few years ago. And so John had known Dallas Willard for a number of years and always relied a lot on his counsel and his wisdom and his humility as an example. And so he felt he would talk to him about what can I do to handle this new responsibility. It's going to add more pressure. So he calls him on the phone, and John had his notebook, paper in hand, pens in hand. He's going to take notes. And so was going to ask Dallas Willard about this new demanding role in ministry. Dallas thought for a minute. It was all on the phone. And he says, "You must ruthlessly eliminate hurry from your life." So John thinks, he writes that down. Okay, what's next? Dallas said, "There is no next. Just do that, John, and you will do fine." Because he knew the man's ability and his conversion and everything else, and he just knew this is one thing that's going to help him, take on more responsibility. And actually good advice for everyone as a pastor or whether a lay member. He repeated again to John. He says, "Hurry is the great enemy of spiritual life in our day." Again, Jesus never hurried, not in that sense. We'll talk about this some more. I think it's worth expanding on. So what is hurry and why so crucial to eliminate it from our lives? This is the way Jesus lived. We can see something by his example. This is written by someone else, James Bryan Smith. I like that Bryan Smith part. My youngest son is Bryan Smith, but this is a different person. Again, he wrote about this, and his book is a really interesting title. It's called "The Good and Beautiful God," page 183 for those taking notes. Anyway, he said it's possible to act quickly without hurrying. If you only have 10 minutes to get from one point in the airport to where your plane is going to be taken off, it's okay to move very quickly, move your feet quickly without hurrying to get to the other place where you're going. He says, hurry is an inner condition that is fear-based. If I don't make my plane, everything will be ruined. Life as I know it is over. But when I walk in step with God, I learn to say, if I don't make that plane, I'll be fine. God is with me. I'll move my legs as fast as I can while my heart is happy and unhurried. I would say, with an exclamation mark, much easier said than done. But that's the goal. And I've tried to even inculcate that a little bit in my house, just walking around instead of moving a little bit faster because I have to get to this point or this bedroom or over. I said, step at a time, be where you're at right now, enjoy the walk, and everything's going to work out just fine. God's in charge. There was another example where Jesus was interrupted on the way to perform a miracle. And this was a healing of, not just a healing, but bringing back to life. It was the healing of the daughter of Jairus, the synagogue leader. That's one of the miracles where Jesus raised a person from the dead. This is back in Mark 5. The leader of the synagogue, Jairus, he was a pretty high-ranking person, begged Jesus to come and heal his daughter who lies at the point of death. So Jesus went with him, and a great multitude followed him and thronged him. You just imagine where Jesus was. This is not a good time to come to Jesus and say, please come with me, you got to do this. This is an emergency. And thronged with people there for a reason. And while this was happening, a great multitude followed him and thronged him, and a woman who had a flow of blood for 12 years touched his garment and was healed. And we know the conversation that took place after that. Again, Jesus was delayed. He didn't say, sorry, lady, I can't talk to you. I got a healing to perform. He took the time. And while he was talking with the woman, and she was healed, and this great miracle occurred right there on the spot. Jairus' servant came and said, your daughter has died. Don't trouble the master anymore. Jesus said, be not afraid, only believe. Again, similar to what he said to Mary and Martha regarding their brother. So he did. We know the story. He went on and to the place, I don't know how far away it was, and raised up Jairus' daughter to life. Again, Jesus delayed for a reason. He didn't let, whatever needed to be done at the time, he took care of it, and that's what he was involved in. This is interesting again. This is a couple paragraphs that I want to read, because I think in these short paragraphs here that the author shows how busy Jesus was, how much he accomplished, what ruled his life. He didn't have a schedule at the beginning of each day and says, okay, I got this appointment, got that appointment. That's not the way he lived his life. Fortunately, a lot of us can't live quite that free, but there's a principle here that I think is very important. And this is how it's described. Again, this is by, I'm trying to get the author on it, again, by Mark Buchanan. How Jesus lived and what his priorities were. Jesus lived life with the clearest and highest purpose, yet he veered and strayed from one interruption to the next, with no apparent plan in hand, other than his single, overarching one: go to Jerusalem and die. That was the main goal that he had. A meeting that he was not going to, be late for. He was on time for that. Everything else, it fit in as it needed to. And continuing on, he says, the eyes go first, I think, when you get old. Okay, get to Jerusalem and die. Otherwise, his days, as far as we can figure, were a series of zigzags and detours, apparent whims and second thoughts, interruptions and delays, off-the-cuff plans, spur-of-the-moment decisions, leisurely meals, serendipitous rounds of storytelling. Jesus was available, or not, according to some oblique logic, all his own. He had an inner ear for the Father's whisper, a third eye for the Spirit's motions. One minute he's not going to the temple, the next he is. One minute he refuses to help a wedding host solve his wine drought, the next he's all over it. He's ready to drop everything and go over to a complete stranger's house to heal his servant, but dawdles 4 days while Lazarus, the one he loves, writhes in his death throes, or fails to come at all when John the Baptist, the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, languishes on death row. The closest we get to what dictated Jesus' schedule is his own statement in John's Gospel. The wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit, which is being led by the Spirit also. And Jesus certainly was. We see that by his example. Interruptions is interesting because that was mentioned in here. One of the things that Jesus was constantly having interruptions. You may have heard of Henry Nouwen, the Catholic priest and writer, and quite written a whole lot and taught. And what's a fine example is, I think, as a Christian, and his compassion for people that were less fortunate. Dedicated a lot of his life, frankly, taking care of severely handicapped people. And he was one time, he was walking on the campus of Notre Dame with an older professor of Notre Dame. And Henry Nouwen had also taught there for some years as well. And while they were walking along talking, the older professor admitted to Henry, he says, "My whole life I have been complaining that my work was constantly interrupted until I discovered that interruptions were my work." How one responds to interruptions is who they really are. And I got thinking about that. What interruptions in my life do I fail to respond like Jesus? He responded with the interruption, gave it his whole thought, his whole effort. He responded completely. And I think all of us can relate to that one degree. In other words, in the workplace where we're getting interrupted, we can't keep doing what we're doing, whether it's fellow employees or I think especially perhaps in the family environment, interruptions is something that's going to happen if you're not living by yourself. Then you're not interrupted, I guess, unless it's the phone. But it's a little easier to ignore than it is family members. It can be a spouse, and you're reading or something, or you're trying to focus, and the person, this wife, husband, comes and says, "Listen to this," or "How about this?" And the temptation is, "Don't bother me. I got work to do." Instead of, like Jesus, full attention. What is it you have to say? And those of us who have had children understand in a very profound way, too, what interruptions are all about. And I can remember times and times, and I regretted not giving the full attention I should have, oftentimes with my kids, and they're especially little, and they want to do something, or they want my time, and they're not thinking about my schedule, but they have a need. And as a parent, that's one of our responsibilities, to be sensitive to that and allow those interruptions to take place. In other words, everything is in God's control. Do you ever feel that we need to be involved in a particular activity or something to control it? Otherwise, it's not going to succeed, or it will fail if we're not the one involved, if we're not the one doing it. It's going to fail. Well, interesting. We realize who's really in charge of everything. Martin Luther, the one from back in the 1600s, wherever it was, 14 maybe. I don't have the history on that down. I didn't look it up. But he had an assistant named Philip. That's just his first name. And they're kind of opposites. Martin Luther was maybe a little rough around the edges. He had a goal, and he went to it, and he achieved it. He was a go-getter. But different from his assistant. His assistant was more detail-oriented. He liked to cross all the T's and dot all the I's and fill in a lot of details. So one morning, Philip announced to Luther, "Today, you and I will discuss the rulership of the universe." Luther thought about it for a minute. We don't know what the expression on his face was, or whether it was happiness or disgust or whatever it was. But he says, "No, my friend, today you and I will go fishing, and we'll leave the rulership of the universe to God." And sometimes we can be like, I had a boss one time that I worked for. The company was involved in quite a large construction project, expanding it quite a bit. And because of all the activities involved, he hired his younger brother, who was a mature man, to help, spearhead certain projects, parts of it anyway, assist anyway. Although he may have been a little, what term can I use? A little loose, a little scatterbrained sometimes, whatever, but his heart was in it. So one time, the younger brother comes to the older brother, my boss, the owner of the company, and says, "This is an emergency. This such and such has happened, and we got to take care of it right now." And his brother calmly said, "Lack of planning on your part does not constitute an emergency on my part." I thought that's a classical. You may have heard that before in different ways, but I wonder sometimes how much God ever looks at us that way. We're wanting help, relief, a miracle right now, and yet a lot of it was brought on maybe by our own lack of planning or discipline. Point number 2. We're down to the second point. We're halfway done. Hopefully, or maybe not that long. Jesus wept. Here's a couple of verses on this where it's mentioned. Jesus in John 11:14-15. Jesus told his disciples, "Lazarus is dead, but let us go to him." Verses 17-19 says, "On his arrival in Bethany, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days." And I explained how we got the 4 days on this. Time he got back there, he was dead. He was really dead and decaying by that time. So Martha went out and met Jesus and said, "If you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know even now God will give you whatever you ask." Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." And then Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live, even though they die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied, "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is come into the world." They knew that Jesus was the Messiah. Not too many people around them understood that. Verse 32, when Mary reached the place where Jesus was, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Those are really powerful words because he displayed that twice in this passage. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. At this point, Jesus wept. When the Jews said, "See how much he loved him," Jesus once more, again, was deeply moved and came to the tomb. So we see here Jesus and his emotional responses to what was going on here. And we need to understand, look at some key words to understand what those emotional responses was like. Why? What was this weeping about? What was being deeply moved? What did that really mean? What John does for us in this particular statement is to uncover to us the heart of Jesus. That was a quote from Timothy Keller, who a book that I've read many over and over is called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. He goes in that topic deeper than anyone I've ever seen, and this was a deep, important quote, even though it's just a short one. John does for us in this particular statement is to uncover to us the heart of Jesus. And that's what we're going to see by looking at these words here briefly. So let's understand how and why Jesus wept in verse 35. But first we need to look at verses 33 and 38, where the expression, "he was deeply moved," is used, and understand what that meant. Deeply moved, other translations have it, he groaned in spirit, or groaned in himself. The Greek implies to bellow with anger. make the body tremble. The classical Greek use of that same word is of a horse snorting. In other words, a horse, this is a powerful reaction. The whole body trembled. So how could the Son of God show such emotion? Jesus showed us a God whose heart is wrung with anguish for the anguish of his people. He brought us the news of a God who cares. That's William Barclay's commentary on this passage. A God who cares. Theologian B.B. Warfield writes, what John tells us in point of fact is that Jesus approached the grave of Lazarus in a state not of uncontrollable grief, but of irrepressible anger. I never quite thought that. I read that into it before, but being deeply moved. You go back to the Greek intention here and the meaning. This was something better than just being emotional, deeper than being emotionally moved. It was an indignation. There was anger involved. And why did he show anger? We know that there was. Let me continue on. I'm going to go on with that same comment, the same thought from Timothy Keller. If it is death that is the object of his wrath, and behind death, him who has the power of death, and who Jesus has come into the world to destroy. Tears of sympathy may fill his eyes, but this is incidental. His soul is held by rage, and he advances to the tomb as a champion who prepares for the battle. So when he says he was deeply moved on these two occasions, he was indignant. He was angry because of what death and pain, sickness and sin has done to the world. He took on the compassion, the pain of all the people in the world that he knew he was going to die for. And it affected him at this point because he saw the death. He saw the sorrow, the great pain, the great wailing of all the people at this, I guess you could call it a funeral, at the death of, 4 days after the death of Lazarus. In Luke 19:41, we see another occasion where Jesus wept. And this was over the city of Jerusalem as he approached it. The Greek word there for wept is kaio. That's how it's pronounced, I guess, basically. Jesus wept. He wept over the city as he approached it. And this Greek word, actually implies to wail aloud or a great outburst of crying. This was something I think he was by himself at the time when he looked over Jerusalem. And he wept so violently and so profoundly in a way of outburst crying because of what he knew was going to come upon that city in the very near future. However, we look into where the passage where wept is used in John 11. It says, I want to go back. I want to mention before I get off the outburst of crying, that same word, kaio, is used to describe weeping of Mary and her friends. That was the kind of crying and weeping they were doing at the funeral. Outburst. It was very audible. But when Jesus wept, the Greek word dekruo, or versions thereof, the word itself actually means tear. It means to cry in silence. And someone described it, you can imagine one tear falling from his eyes while he was sorrowing because of what was happening here. And he knew, of course, what he was going to be doing. He sorrowed for the people. He sorrowed for our pain, for our losses. Let's go just a little bit deeper here into the emotions of Jesus. He showed a full range here from being fully indignant and angry to being deeply sorrowful. Isaiah 53, verses 3 and 4 says, "He is despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we did not esteem him. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows." That's what he was doing when he wept at the graves of Lazarus, seeing all the sadness and the sorrow and the pain of all the people around him. Satan uses our fear of death as a weapon against us. And that was mentioned actually in Hebrews. It refers to that. It says Jesus shared physical death with us, humans, that through death he might destroy him who had the power of death, that is, the devil, and release those who through fear of death were all their lifetime subject to bondage. So Jesus was both angry and sorrowful about the sin and death of mankind. I want to take the time to cover these 2 points, maybe some may consider minor points, whatever, that maybe not have been emphasized in other, say, Bible studies or sermons on this message, but I think they're important enough that I felt that that's something we could all learn from and be helpful with us. For the past 15 years or so, I studied the parables and miracles of Jesus, the healings of Jesus, especially the healings, and it reveals so much about the love, the compassion, the mercy to Jesus' fellow man, because that's what they were. They were his fellow man. He was human, just like them, just like us. If he were standing right here today, he felt and felt everything that we have felt. So the raising of Lazarus, although there's a lot of other things accomplished here, I use the term raising of Lazarus. I know I've even seen certain messages titled The Resurrection of Lazarus. Well, technically, it's not a resurrection. Because if we go to 1 Corinthians 15, we see what a resurrection really is. It's resurrecting, it's coming to life from a body that was dead and corrupt into a body that will never die. Lazarus was raised up, or some use the word resuscitated. However, that sounds a little weaker, but he was dead. He was raised up, the same body he had when he died, except now it was healthy. But he eventually died. He was going to need to be resurrected. So I have just a minor, maybe technical use of the word there. So if this passage on the raising of Lazarus from death lists several vital truths about Jesus. And I brought just a couple of them. Here's a few others that were mentioned that could be expanded into probably sermons each. Martha knew Jesus was the Messiah. Jesus is the source and the substance of the resurrection to eternal life. He had emotions we can relate to: anger, sadness, compassion. He had close friends. We must believe in order to witness God's glory. These are all phrases and examples taken from this passage of 45 verses in John 11. Jesus delays healing, intervening for various reasons. So any of these could be a topic for a sermon. I just chose 2 of them today. When Jesus waited and when Jesus wept. I want to close with another passage from John 20. And this is what John says. It kind of summarizes what we've been talking about in a broader way. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. That was the whole purpose for all the miracles that Jesus performed, and to glorify God.